To continue the story of the Contract Buyers League, please welcome to the stage Ralph Blessing, who volunteered at the Contract Buyers League as a student organizer, and Sandra York, a daughter of Ruby and Robert York, who bought a home in North Lawndale and whose decision to participate in the Contract Buyers League helped the organization make history. And to lead the conversation, please welcome Atlantic staff writer Vann Newkirk. Vann, please take it away.
So Ralph, we, in that video, we just saw that race tax of $20,000 per family. You got involved with the Contract Buyers League after they found that out. What was the Contract Buyers League? What were their objectives, and how did you meet those objectives?
Well, the objectives originally of the organization were to discover that type of data, which in today's dollars doesn't sound like a significant amount, but at the time, if you saw those housing prices on that list, imagine what that would be in today's dollars. It amounted to roughly a 75% markup on average between what the sellers paid for the property, often just days earlier, and turned around and sold it to a black family at an inflated rate. So this took a while to get that information out of the community because there was a hesitancy to basically admit that you were taken advantage of. But when you're desperate for housing and desperate for a place to raise your kids, and people do desperate things, and sometimes you may not even think it's a viable solution, but you sign on the dotted line and you had a house. Only later did they find out that they and their neighbors were really the result of a, if not illegal, certainly unethical campaign by blockbusters and people who were willing to take advantage of them because of the color of their skin.
So you had a house, but you weren't building equity, right?
Exactly.
And so how were people, when the Contract Buyers League decided to act against it, they were withholding their payments, correct? That
was not the initial step, but the effort, the documentation was made of what the difference between the buying and selling price, and presented to them, to the sellers, I guess, and requesting that they renegotiate the contracts and make them closer to a mortgage, if not, in fact, an actual mortgage, except for one individual, apparently, who had a come-to-Jesus moment and woke up, and his wife convinced him that they had overcharged. They had cheated the buyers. And the rest of the real estate folks just said, we're not. It's legal. They signed it. Tough nails, if you will. And so when they resisted any effort to renegotiate, that is when this tactic came up of we will withhold our payments, our monthly payments. We will make them into an escrow account, so the money is there. It's not that we're trying to avoid paying the money, but we will not give it to them. And that eventually enticed a number of the others to enter into renegotiations of the contracts.
You say essentially that this was considered to be a legal practice. You did take legal action, correct? There was a lawsuit?
There was a lawsuit, actually two of them, one for the West Side community and later on for a group of homeowners in the South Side. But after years working its way through the system, these cases were dismissed, so they did not resolve the matter. But I think renegotiations ended up benefiting over 300 homeowners in the Lawndale community over the course of the years that this process was underway.
Sandra, we talked about your family history yesterday.
Yes.
We had lunch. You were telling me about the roots of your family in Mississippi and how they come up and get this home that's considered a part of the American dream,
Correct.
but it's on contract.
Yes.
What have you learned from your parents about their story, about their motivation to buy a house, about how they felt after realizing this contract was just a disadvantageous device?
Well, remember, I also indicated that my parents actually hid us from a lot of what was going on. But in asking questions later on, and just the unfairness of what happened, they just always told us to fight for what you believe in. And that's what they did, and they came out on top.
And do you think there was a sense of, in North Lawndale, other communities, a sense of maybe shame that they had been hoodwinked?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My dad even, he just told my mom, do not go to those meetings. And she was like, no, I'm going. This has to be done.
She went anyway.
She went anyway.
And how the situation, what was the resolution? What was the course of events there?
They actually did do the renegotiating, and they actually came out on top. I think it was like in the range of like $8,000 or something like that.
$8,000.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you growing up, now with this $8,000 returned to your family, what was your sense of how it impacted your family's sense of belonging, your sense of community, and your love for North Lawndale? Oh,
I love the community. I loved being there. The family and other families that were there as well. The pride that they had in the community, and we just, we felt like we could really stand tall, because of what my mom and eventually my dad, who did come along, they stood up. We were very proud of that.
What's it like for you watching that video, seeing all those folks who were in it with your parents, going through all this? And I think the line that gets me is the woman who says, it's not much, but it's mine.
Correct.
That's heavy, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But they made us feel like we were rich. Mm-hmm. We had everything. Everything that we needed, and that was the love and strength and, their determination. That's what we had.
Ralph, Contract Buyers League was an interracial effort, right? There were lots of people from lots of places, races, class spaces involved in this. What about your own background, your family background, gets you to go and volunteer for this organization that's doing something really risky?
Actually, I was only in with the other students for a 2-week period during the summer of 1967. I went to work straight out of high school and was working at an insurance company, and my brother was part of that student group, recruited by Jack McNamara. And so I thought, what better way to spend my 2-week summer vacation than hanging around Lawndale? Mm-hmm. And so I did a bit of canvassing and the like at that point, but I went into Peace Corps later on, and after returning, contacted Jack and said, I'd really like to spend time working with CBL. And by that time, a fundraising foundation had been established, and so I ended up working there, in effect, as a paralegal with the legal teams that were doing pro bono work on behalf of CBL. So it allowed me to interact with the buyers on a regular basis, interviewing them, getting the kind of data that would be needed to argue the case in court. But what motivated me to, I don't know, I was a child of the 60s, so I guess maybe that was it as much as anything.
But it doesn't just stop for you with the CBL. You live in a community now in DC that's also gone through similar changes, through similar instances of segregation. What's your lifelong experience and engagement and interface with housing segregation been like? And now that we are decades past, what's your sense, looking back, what are the trends been?
It's hard to say. I grew up in a very working class neighborhood where I was told the original settlers were the African Americans who were next door and a couple doors up, and that my dad knew growing up, and so it was sort of that struggle, if you will, between my white classmates at the Catholic school I attended and the folks I knew from childhood who were my neighbors. But I eventually just, as the civil rights movement took hold in the U.S., it really resonated with me, and I just felt that was the way to go for my own personal convictions and practices to the extent possible.
Sandra, you've since moved on from your parents' home, from that contract house. What emotions were you having when you bought your own home and thinking about legacy, inheritance, that same sentiment of it's mine? Yeah.
Yeah. The feeling was just, and I don't want to get emotional either. I knew that my mom and dad would be very proud that I had the support from so many who, made sure that I didn't go through what they went through. So.
And they're with you. And
yeah.
We talked about how you were advised when you went through this process of not to seek an FHA loan. So this is like
correct.
Coming back in history, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's coming back to you.
It's coming back, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Ralph, I want to get your sense of, we're sitting here thinking about this now 50 years on, the impact of the CBL, not just in North Lawndale, not just in Chicago, but in how we think about this problem today nationwide.
I guess I wish I could say it had a distinctly positive impact, but just from what you hear in recent months, years, I guess even during the housing crisis, how people lost their homes to begin with, and how properties were gobbled up and resold in some cases on, if not contracts, something very much like a contract. So I guess the greatest impact would be the awareness that organizations like CBL have helped create in the population as a whole, that the fact that this many people will come out to listen to an event like this or a discussion like this, and it's just 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, and it's an ongoing struggle.
For me, Sandra, I think the fact that you're here is an optimistic sign. I mean, we talked about this again yesterday, how you had a chance to talk to and engage with Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. That video was a supplement to his groundbreaking case for reparations, right? So I think people now nationwide are considering, even if housing segregation is still entrenched, thinking about solutions. Correct. How do you see that movement, the impact, what your parents went through and advised you on, beyond your own experience to the people the young folks now in your community? Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Whenever I just even hear of a young person wanting to buy, and it's like, oh, we need to have a conversation, and, make sure you check all avenues, do your homework. There are resources out there, people who will help. You just need to just say something, and a lot of times I think from back then that people, they just didn't share. And it wasn't that they didn't want to share, but people just felt like, you know, this was just a bad experience and let me just move on from it, you know, and not share anything, so.
I want to queue up for questions soon, so everybody start thinking about your good questions. Just one more for you, you know, that what we pass down, especially as black folks. What are you telling young people who are seeking their own homes? It's still this very American sense of that you have carved out your space and done what you need to do as a good American. What are you warning people against? What are you telling them is the right way to go? How do you pass it on?
Just letting them know, you know, one, keep good credit. But two, like I say, just knowing your options, knowing what's out there, you know, FHA as opposed to conventional. You know, what may work better for you as opposed to, you know, what worked for me. You know, there's particular situations, how much house they want, you know, where you want to move to, you know. So, I mean, I'm having those conversations quite often, yeah.
Okay.
Gail Woodward, and I used to work in politics in Georgia, and one of the main things I saw as far as taking housing away from people was the privatization of tax collection. And I was wondering if y'all have had any experience with that. If the accountable government officials just outsource the collection of past due property taxes, then it makes it easier to avoid accountability for pissing off a big group of people that they screw over.
I'm not familiar with that myself. Yeah.
Neither am I. Oh, for three, but I think that's a great question, and I'm going to keep it in my back pocket for a story, maybe. So, anybody else?
Hi, I'm Deborah Cole, and I was just wondering, did that exactly end the contract buying process? Were other homeowners going forward, were they offered regular mortgages, or did it just ease the terms of the contracts, and did they continue?
My understanding, since I was no longer in Chicago at the time, but is that once this matter was being resolved for the original group of homeowners through renegotiations, that the FHA admitted the error of its ways to a certain extent. The banks in Chicago were willing to lend a hand in furthering the renegotiation process, making future potential buyers accessible, or having standard mortgages accessible to them, much more so at least than they have been in the past. So, but whether that's, how far along that, I mean, did that, we know it's still not totally a level playing field. So when you've got wealth that's accumulated generation after generation, when two groups of people are in different tracks, then the credit worthiness, if you will, is identified in this manner versus that manner. And so,
Sandra said to keep good credit, but you already start from a deficit, right, with the credit?
I think so, yes. I mean, it's, and again, when it's not just the financial aspect, as Clyde Ross said in the video, when you are away from your home 80, 90% of the time, what does that do to family life? If we know how important it is to have a male figure, father figure in the house, and yet if the kids look at him and said, "Who are you?" It's just such a widespread issue, and it's more than a dollar and cents matter.
Devin Bunton, I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and this question is mine, not theirs. I'm required to tell you. So as an economist, I quickly adjusted the $8,000 that you got back, Ms. York, for inflation, and that's about $70,000, depending on what exactly year we're speaking, which is a sizable fraction of the racial wealth gap today between black families and white families. And so I wondered if you or anyone on the panel had any thoughts on that. It was reflecting sort of the magnitude of the issues for families and sort of keeping class distinctions and race distinctions in line.
No, I certainly didn't. I mean, if I benefited from it in terms of, you know, of course my dad supported us, but he kept it close to the vest. But I'm not.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
That's 70,000 today. In today's dollars.
Yeah.
It matters a lot, but it doesn't close the gap. And so I think we still have lots ahead of us to think about just how big that gap really is, and not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in terms of hours missed with your family and other ways that people are involved in closing it. And so you're actually going to hear some more of that later today. So thank you for your questions.
And 70,000, if you had that money back then, you could have grown that money, in effect. So it's not just a stable or a static number, which, again, helps explain the disparity, the white-black disparity in terms of accumulated wealth over generations.
Well, I want to thank you all for your amazing questions. That question was great. And thank you to Ralph and to Sandra for coming and for sharing your insights in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Vann.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.